Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today we'll be going over how to optimize a tank build, as well as an example of such a tank build. The clip you see here in the background is just me going through Caldera on this build and showing how it fares against enemies without buffing like crazy. But don't worry, I will also go over limit testing, where I'm pushing the build as hard as I can against bosses. To tease you guys a little bit, here are the stats I will end up with. To give you guys some justification for this build, many builds on the Outward Wiki, not all of them, but many tank builds there, really emphasize either resistances or protection, and there is a big problem with this perspective. Resistances reduce the incoming damage by a certain percentage, meanwhile protection, or also known as barrier, reduces the incoming damage by a flat amount. The bane of resistances is the property known as ignore half resistances, which does what it says on the tin, and it makes the enemy ignore half of your resistances. Meanwhile, the problem with protection or barrier is that some attacks include multiple elements at once, and barrier has the problem that it only applies to one element at a time, and it prioritizes elements which you have low resistances in. The priority issue only manifests into taking more damage if you have a build that runs both resistances and barrier. But for now, let us only consider resistance builds and barrier builds. I will return to these mixed builds later. So here is an extreme example I made for a resistance build. I just modded in an item and given it 100% resistances to all damage types. Here's an example of enemies who will do a lot of damage to you even with 100% resistances. And to reiterate, this is caused by the ignore half resistances property. And here I've added an item that gives a lot of protection and barrier. So let's say some examples where this doesn't work. I will also mention that barrier is unable to deal with damage over time effects, as we can see with the gas resin. We can then summarize our findings into a nice chart which categorizes the enemies if they're able to deal damage, if you have resistance or protection. We see now clearly that neither resistance builds or protection/barrier builds are very effective in Caldera, but there is a good case you can make for running hybrid builds, as you would only be weak to two enemy archetypes, that being Scarlet Emissaries and the Medyse. How tanky can we theoretically get, and is there any possibility that we can get this tanky with the restriction of the gear that we have available? In other words, what resistance is required, what protection is required, and what barrier is required. The easiest one to answer is we need 100% resistances in all damage types. Except this isn't actually true. If we have barrier, that means that we can skip one of the damage types. But which one can we actually skip? The answer can be found in the diagram that we had earlier. If we have max out resistances in 4 of the 5 elemental damage types, that means that all enemies in the orange area will be taken care of. We don't need to care about the green area, because those have damage in one type. So a barrier will function properly and remove all the damage. The Medyse and the Scarlet Emissary will then determine which elements can be maxed and which can be neglected. That gives us this list of conditions. The way these conditions are determined is by making sure that the barrier is applied to the element with the highest damage. To break this down into specifics, consider the drifting Medyse. The blast attack does 15 fire damage and 5 ethereal, and we need to make sure that 15 fire damage is eaten by the barrier and the remaining 5 ethereal damage needs to pass through 100% ethereal resistance. To force this, fire resistance needs to be less or equal to ethereal, and ethereal resistance needs to be maxed out. And this can be done for all the relevant attacks for Medyse and Scarlet Emissaries. We get 4 valid configurations, where 3 of them allows us to look away from one element. Now for the last big chunk, we gotta figure out how much protection and barrier is required. We need protection equally high as the highest physically damaging enemy in the game, which has the ignore resistance property after they have been inflicted with weaken. As a reference, weaken reduces the enemy's physical resistance by 40%, and the elite Gargoyle Warrior has the highest physical damage in the aforementioned category. This requires us to have 36 protection. Now for the barrier. To solve for the barrier, we return to the table. There are 2 cases we need to catch. We need to make sure that we have enough barrier to catch the highest damage we can be targeted with in our weak stat, and we also need to make sure that we have enough barrier to cover the case when we are facing an enemy who deals elemental damage and has the ignore resistance property. As far as I can tell, the highest frost damage in the game is the elite Krypteia Witch, dealing 50 frost, elite Burning Man, dealing 50 fire damage, and the elite Mantis Shrimp, dealing 75 lightning damage. Numbers from the wiki. The highest elemental damage from an enemy with ignore resistance is from the different varieties of Medyse. This doesn't mean that the barrier is required to be 50. We still have the ability to apply Sapt and Hexes. Sapt reduces elemental damage taken by 40%, and Hexes reduces the elemental damage taken by 25%. This means that we can reduce our elemental damage taken by 65% if you use both these effects together. Which means that we get the following table. Putting everything together, we get 4 different configurations with stats we need to attain to achieve the theoretical maximum tankiness. I have found one combination of gear which fits the requirement for combo 1, but assume it might be possible as well to find gear combinations for combo 2, combo 3 and combo 4. The toughest part is definitely to find high elemental resistance while also having a high physical protection. The build combination I found is the following. We're running a Vigilante Sword, a Tsar Helm with Calm Soul, Candleplate Armor with the Aegis enchantment, and the Blue Sand Boots with the Aegis enchantment. Lantern of Souls for additional resistance, and Weaver's Backpack for status resist. Astral Pistol and Virgin Lantern for hexes, and a Lexicon for runic protection. Here are also some important defensive items. These are the stats before buffs. And here are my vitals. Before buffing up, I will show you my skills and my passives. For reference, I picked the Holy Mission faction. So let us fully buff, setting up the totems first. I'll be using potions, but for boons I will typically just use the skill tab. I have invested enough mana such that you can use all the boons without running out of mana, even with the helmet. Here's the final stats and the active effects. We are now closing up on the final dungeon on this rotation, and after that I'll be showing some of the extreme cases. So that means Scarlet Emissary, the different kinds of Medyse, Elite Gargoyle, Krypteia Witch, Calixa, Elite Torcrab, Elite Crimson Avatar, and finally the Elite Ash Giants. I will also show the numerical prediction for how much damage I am supposed to take according to my calculations, so you can compare it with whatever is shown in game. Some other things I want to mention while we're going through here is that I have also focused on status resistance as a secondary stat, because I could afford it due to the backpack slot being free. And this allows us to reach over 100% status resistance, which is one of the ways you can die even with having full resistances and protection. For example, through petrification. So this setup allows us to also be able to not die from petrification or other status effects, with the exception of Gift of Blood, which I'm not running anyway. What remains dangerous at this point is then fall damage, raw damage, and durability loss. Durability is not an issue in most fights, except those which has a shockwave attack which triggers multiple times per second. An example of this is with the Elite Torcrab, but you also have the Elite Crimson Avatar. The Elite Torcrab is the worst of them, as he can trigger shockwave damage every 0.1 seconds. He can also have 5 or more shockwaves active at once. In this case, Dispersion, which is the one that's supposed to do 50 damage, and it is supposed to do that, and it does do that, does nothing as calculated. However, Dispersion, it has an additional hit other than the base hit, which does 8 damage, which is quite strange. But otherwise, it seems to be working as calculated. That is all for today. Thank you all for watching. Hope you have a great one. If there's any questions or anything you want to point out, suggestions for how to improve the build or other builds, feel free to drop them in the comments below and I'll be reading them. Have a great day. Take care. Bye bye.